Very good morning and Shabbat Shalom. Welcome, come on in, grab a seat. We are Cornerstone Baptist Church. We're in Salem, Oregon, and we're gathering on this Saturday morning, a place that God has prepared for us to find his peace. That's why we say Shabbat Shalom. There's a peace available today. How many of you, looking at this calendar up here, is that the way you think about calendars? In a circle? Kind of? I'm going to go to the next slide, just so you can't see it. How many of us think linear when we think of a calendar or a timeline? You know, you start over here and you march off to the right. And how many of us think cyclic? This linear thing is a Western Greek mentality. If you studied science and technology, mathematics, you spent a lot of time on the number line. There's actually a branch of mathematics for what you do with this stuff that goes circular. How many of you enjoyed trigonometry? It's the entire branch focused on what do we do when you get to this point and this point, but they're really the same point. It's just one cycle later. That's trigonometry. We think this linear model, this might be helpful. And so it's not just a circle, it's more like a spring or a coil where, let's see, we have an anniversary coming up in a couple of weeks. That anniversary is the same time of year as it was last year, and it's stacked on top of what happened in the previous years. So it's the same, and yet it's different. This cyclic, this coil, this spring is a good way, if we're very linear, it's a good way to think this way. But sometimes you do have to unspring the coil to see, oh, wait a minute, it makes sense to spread them out. So this week is Leviticus 23, where is the first time that we see all of the feasts, all of the holidays in order. And Matthew came off the screen. It changed on the drive here, which is fine. Emor. The 31st reading from the Torah is called Emor, a title that comes from the first verse of the reading, which says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron." Emor begins with special laws of sanctity, propriety, and purity for the priesthood. Leviticus 23 provides an overview of the biblical calendar, a listing of the Lord's appointed times, Moedim. Today the Torah portion is Leviticus 21 through 24. Last year I read 21. I'll spend today on the 22. The holiness of the priest, the use of holy offerings, acceptable offerings, and then 23 starts the appointed festivals, and then there's a list of them. The Shabbat, Passover, unleavened bread, offering of first fruits, festival of weeks, festival of trumpets, Day of Atonement, the festival of booths, the lamp, the bread for the tabernacle, and blasphemy and its punishment. We have something happens in the story. Something happens chronologically. So we have a bunch of teaching, and remember, we see a lot in these portions. Then the Lord said to Moses. So it's like he gets a teaching, he writes it down somewhere, and at some point they're all compiled together, but then we have something that happens actually in a time and space. There's an event. We've talked quite a bit. This is our 7th week in Leviticus. We only have one more. Can you imagine? Are we doing a good job? I hope. In Ezekiel, we have the rules for Levitical priests, more specific, the Zadokian priests. And then in Matthew, Yeshua before Caiaphas and the council, I added a couple of verses before and after the reading from First Fruits of Zion. The reading after is about Peter's denial, and that's a really good one that I don't want to miss. A question that I have for you, I've been up here about like a year and a half. There's certain topics that come up every year, but just looking at this portion, we can't cover everything. So every single year, we're focusing on a little bit. There are some things that come up repeatedly, and kind of my ongoing question is only once a year enough? Is once a year too much for certain conversations? Like a year ago, I spent a significant amount of time on the don't cut yourself in your beard and things like that. And I believe that what I did this morning with my bzzz is no connection to what's prohibited with the pagan rites for the dead as described in Scripture. How often should I bring up those topics? If I did it a year ago, should I do it again, or should I do it every 2 years or every 3 years? It's an ongoing discussion. I was a classroom teacher, and a lot of things we taught every single year. But hopefully we didn't have the same kids in the same class. It happens sometimes, or you're held back a year. But looking out here, we're probably 2/3 of the people were here a year ago when we did this Torah portion. So if you do want more, you can go back on YouTube and watch them. That's what I do and count how many times I say, So I did this a year ago, and when you use words like Sabbath, there is a reaction from the Western Christian community. There's a reaction, and it's based on this. It's based on the belief that in the New Covenant we go to the right. And so I did this a year ago, so feedback, tell me afterwards or when we pass the microphone, are we ready for this again, or should I have waited a year? So centralized, and often we hear this concept in an economics class or a governance class. It's about leadership most of the time. But centralized is not all times, places, and people are equal. Centralized power, like if you have a king, they have all of the authority. And there's other people with virtually none of the authority. This is a centralized concept. In a theological sense, centralized presence of God. Is God in one place or in every place? If God is in one place, you can turn your back on him. If God is in every place, no matter which direction you go, you're going toward him. Differential access to God. If we have a centralized concept in theology, there are some people who can be closer to God than others. The last one on the list is holy. Holy means set apart. It means set apart for a purpose. It also means set apart from things. Saying the word holy is a centralized theological concept, because you're saying if you're set apart for this, you're set apart from that. You're making a distinction. On the far side are the opposite of all of these. It is thinking that all times, places, and people are equal. It's thinking there's completely distributed power. Everyone has the same authority. Everyone has the same vote, right? Equal presence of God. God is in all places at all times. No matter where you are, no matter what's going on, you have the same access to him. And then common. Common is the opposite of holy. So this is a big deal because many people think the Old Testament was centralized, and as Revelation came, particularly the New Covenant, we went further and further to the right. And if you believe that as a tenet of your faith, that accepting Messiah is moving to the right, then anytime someone brings up something that is further left than you want to be, you take it as letting go of Messiah. It's very offensive. So we have to wrestle through some of these things. We in America are very individualistic. We're way over here. And through church history, if we remember back, in the Catholic system, very centralized authority, and there was the Protestant Reformation where they're like, let's put the Bible in the hands of everybody, as opposed to having, one Bible that one person could read. Let's put it in the hands of everybody. The Protestant Reformation is a step to the right. And then you have the Anabaptist Reformation, which went even further to the right, dealing with the class system in society, saying that a duke or the aristocracy is not better than the common people. So we have this concept in our tradition. We're at a Baptist church and we're in America. We have the idea that moving to the left is archaic and religious and old, and moving to the right is freedom. We believe this, and some believe it stronger than others, but the most centralized word in all of Scripture, echad. Who is left out of that? Everybody. That's unique, singular. And what's on the other side? Well, there's a math symbol, infinity. If we take the word Trinity, on a number line that goes from 1 to infinity, where's the number 3? It's way over here. I tried my best. It's a Celtic knot. It's a symbol of 3. But yeah, it's a very centralized concept. So let's look at, we are discussing the priests in this section. So when it says, say to the priests, the sons of Aaron, that is a centralized idea because of how many people that statement excludes. If you didn't notice, there's a clear, crisp boundary on this side because centralized includes strong boundaries. Decentralized, everything's mixed up, loosey-goosey, nobody knows where they are. So that's kind of a fuzzy boundary. So right here, I drew a circle of Israel. At this point in the story, they're still around Mount Sinai. Was it a clear boundary whether you were in Israel or out of Israel? If they interacted with other people at that time, was it obvious to everybody who was in and who was out? So inside Israel here, we have the mixed multitude. So there was a group of people who came with them. They're a year out of Egypt. These people, theologically, we believe they are Israel. We have those one law comments. But practically, they still spoke different languages. They still looked different. They still maybe had different cultures. And we hear about one of those today, where an Israelite was married to an Egyptian, and then there's that problem of the blaspheme, which means it's called out. This is one of the ones, they're in the big group, but they felt like they were on the periphery. We talk a lot about the Levites. The Levites are like 1/12 of Israel. That's getting more centralized. Anytime you're centralized, you're drawing a boundary, you're saying who's in and who's out. Even more isolated, the priests. Who are the priests? Aaron and his sons. At this point, how many people is that? Well, 3 of the first generation, but then we have Phineas and some others. There might be some grandsons in there. That's a really small group out of about, a couple million? Anytime you talk about a small group and what God's doing with the small group, if this is a tenet of your faith, you fight against it because you're like, what about me? It gets even smaller, that little yellow gold circle there. Who's that? That's Aaron, the priest, the high priest. There's one. And I have to add one more. That little white dot is Moses. There are 2 unique individuals in Israel right now, Moses and Aaron. They're in a class of 1 by themselves. So there are certainly verses that say it used to be this way and it's going to be this way. There are lots of verses that say that. This is one of the great ones. Joel 2:28, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. When it says pour out my spirit on all flesh, it is alluding back to the anointing of the priests. It is a reference to the high priest having the oil poured on his head, which means this verse is saying one person used to be anointed that way, and it will happen to everybody. There certainly are verses that say this. Many things get confusing to us. I'll go back once. There are verses that are centralized and there's verses that are decentralized. In our wee little brains, that gets confusing to us. It actually is a childish tendency when we are absolute, either or, all or nothing. All children think like that. Hopefully not all adults think like that. But we all were that at some point. Now, compare a human child to a human adult. Human child, human adult. God is so much more mature than that. Things make sense to him that don't make sense to adult humans. And we call them paradox. 2 seemingly contradictory truths. 2 things that are true. Is he a lion or a lamb? Yes. And I like this picture because obviously the lamb is heavier than the lion. There are many things that confuse us where it's like, the reason why we don't understand is because we're mortal, because we're human. That's why. In the same way we don't judge our little kids because things don't make sense to them, God doesn't judge us when there's things about his nature that confuse us. So it's okay. Learning to hold on to a paradox is a great skill. And the centralized and decentralized. Is there too far to the right? Probably. Is there too far to the left? Maybe. Probably. So let's look at some biblical examples. Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava. At that time, was there any humans outside of God's presence? No. All humans had equal opportunity, equal access. I will not say that God related to Adam and Adam related to Eve. I won't say that. I'll say Adam and Eve were one, and they related equally to God. Was God centralized or decentralized? Was God always there, or did he come and go? He came and went. At least from their perspective, there was a time when he wasn't there. Or, and that's what's so interesting about the story, if you think God isn't there, then you think you can sneak. You ever had kids try to sneak something, but you saw them do it? I think that's kind of what's going on there in the garden. So in the garden, differential access to God, holy, there are boundaries, but the boundaries were not, well, the boundaries inside the garden were, stay away from that one tree, but then the fact that there's a garden means there's a boundary, which means most of the world was not garden. There was in garden and there was out of garden. That is quite centralized. And their great character, Noah. When God spoke to Noah and told him to build the ark, was he also talking to other people in China? If it's centralized, then we're like, God was talking to one person at one time. If it's decentralized, we're like, well, it can't be that. How many people got included in the ark? How many people got excluded from the ark? It's very centralized. Oh, the temple is probably the most centralized. If you lived in Israel, even right now in the wilderness time, they're in the camp. They probably were not ever outside of eyesight of the tabernacle. They probably were always close enough that they could either see it or they could see the cloud. But they knew, like let's say the tabernacle's that way. If you look that way, you're looking toward God's presence. If you look this way, you're looking away from God's presence. The concept that you could be in Jerusalem, and it had to have been in their minds, if I take a step that way, I'm getting closer to God. If I take a step this way, I'm getting further from God. That's an interesting thought that we don't think that way, because we don't tend to ascribe a geographical location in this time. But yeah, the temple is very centralized. The 12 disciples, where did he pick them from? Remember back to that circle of Israel and smaller circle of Levites and smaller circle of priests. Where did he pick these guys? They weren't from the most exclusive group. Clearly, because of social class, they weren't the highly educated. They weren't well trained. They were working for their parents. And the 12 disciples turns into, there was a larger group of disciples. Right now, we're counting the Emor. We're in this cycle of counting weeks from after Passover to Pentecost. We're in that cycle. That's what they were doing. They were in the upper room, waiting. And it was more than 120. Whenever the number grows, we're moving this way. What happens after the 120? And there's lots of connections with what happens right after. Connections with the tongues of fire, the pouring out, those are all allusions back to what happened at Mount Sinai with God's presence coming. And now it's 3,000, and then we have this classic verse. Basically, they were all so closely knit together that they sold their stuff and shared everything in common. Common is the opposite of holy. Is your bank account common or holy? Yeah, it's holy. You keep it pretty close to the vest. So there is a progression that way. And then probably the most decentralized verse that we have is this one. Galatians 3:28, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, there's no male and female, you are all one in Christ Jesus. How literal is that verse? Because there are people today that take it very literally. That there's no difference between male and female. There's no difference between culture. Really, does this say that a Jew, at the time, in the first century, that a Jewish wedding was the same as a Greek wedding? No, they're not saying that. Or a Jewish worship service and a Greek worship service. The slave nor free, this was a hot topic because in their economic system, there were people who had jobs that were called slaves. Not exactly a caste system, but because you could work your way out of it. It was more an economic system. But it was a big deal. What if you had servants or slaves and you accepted Messiah? You became a Christian. What do you do? Or what if you were a slave and you became a Christian? This is a hot topic and it's discussed a lot. This verse can be taken too literally. Obviously, there are people today that apparently there's a discussion whether there are any differences between male and female. Apparently, that's a hot topic. So the next question I might ask is, are there verses in the New Testament that are on the centralized side? Yeah. Here's a good one. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. The word Jerusalem is a centralized concept. And if a tenet of your faith is that in the new covenant we move as far to the right as we can, if that's a tenet of your faith, the word Jerusalem has to be spiritualized. Because the word Jerusalem refers to a geographic location. And it is scary to think the New Jerusalem comes out of heaven and doesn't come to Salem, Oregon. What are we going to do? What does it mean when God has designated a geographic place or a time and place as more holy or more set apart or more special than others? That's why when we use words like Jerusalem or feasts, it is offensive because a tenet of the Western Christian perspective is moving to the right is toward Jesus, moving to the left is toward the law. And it's a misunderstanding that God is both things. Leviticus. We've spent 7 weeks in Leviticus. If you think you can only move to the right, Leviticus is a really scary book because it emphasizes something that is very countercultural. It emphasizes that God is at one place at one time, that God is doing something here and now, not there then. Leviticus has a whole bunch of that in it. That's why it's such a difficult book for people. Moedim, that was the first slide. The first... I'm not sure what the next button says. Yeah. I'll just say Shabbat. If you say the word Shabbat or Sabbath, it is offensive to the Christian tradition because the Christian tradition says this. No matter where you are, no matter what day it is, God is equally accessible. And there is truth to that. Has anyone ever been on a road trip? They're driving through the car and they're like, we need to pray. And they look at the clock, it says 10:39, and they're like, oh, we can't pray now, God's not available. Has anyone ever thought that? No. God doesn't have visiting hours. Or you're driving along and you're like, we need to pray. Oh, we can't pray yet. We're in Marion County. God isn't here. So we're very decentralized theologically. We believe no matter where you are, God is accessible. And yet, when you say the word Shabbat, it's the opposite direction of that. If you say there's value in the Shabbat, then you have to ask, well, what about Friday? It's not fair. What about Sunday? It's not fair. So we need to wrestle with this, and this is why it's so abrasive to say Sabbath to people, because they're like, move to the right, move to the right, move to the right. 1 Thessalonians 5:1, now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you. Has anyone had a discussion of chronos versus kairos in the Greek? If you went to Bible school, you probably did. Chronos is the time, the engineering, precision time, calendar time, clock time. It can be large time, thousands of years. It can be small times down to the second. And kairos is more a seasonal appropriateness of time. It's the right opportunity. And often in Bible school, they say this is the only thing that matters. We have language for an appointed time in the Christian circles. An appointed time means you go someplace to some store and you meet someone from high school and you pray with them and you're like, God prepared that for us. In Christian perspectives, kairos is emphasized, but it's always spontaneous, which means you didn't know about it. You just walked along and fell into what God had. What if it was on the calendar? So chronos is God always has prepared an appointed time. That's our definition of the Moedim, is God has always prepared an appointment for us. They're called the Moedim. They're on the calendar. That doesn't mean he can't do the other thing also. We talk in the communications class and the other things that we do. Some of us think romance has to be kairos. It has to be spontaneous. But the reality is, if you don't schedule it, it's not going to happen anyway. So this tension, there is an understanding in, been around lots of people in Bible school and books and stuff. There's lots of understanding on this, and it usually is, you don't know that it's an important time until after God did something. And that's contrary to the biblical calendar. So yes, he can do these things, but more so, this would be setting your alarm to go have that divine appointment at the grocery store. Why do you set your alarm? Because God has communicated at such and such a time, I'm going to do such and such a thing. If we're over here, kairos, we believe no one knows the day or the hour. If we're over here, we're like, he did all of his things on his calendar. Why would he break that? So this is the tension if you ever say words like Shabbat or Passover. What you're saying is there is a time and a place. One of the questions, and we'll get into this on the next slide. Some people are discluded from service because of a blemish, or not something they did, but how they were born. That is a very centralized concept. What sense of that do we make? It's not fair. Centralized is not fair in our American individualistic culture. We believe that everyone has equal access to everything. All right. Let's pray as we begin to read Leviticus 22. Father, I thank you for this group. I thank you for what you prepared for us in advance, not 1 week in advance or 1 year in advance, but from the creation of the world, that you would carve a groove in time and place and call that thing Shabbat. And you would ask us to come sit in it with you. Thank you for that invitation, and thank you for the blessing that is found here on your Shabbat. We ask this in your Son's holy name. Leviticus 22, and Yehovah spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to Aharon and his sons so that they abstain from the holy things of the people of Israel, which they dedicate to me, so that they do not profane my holy name. I am Yehovah. Last week we talked about, or maybe the last week, twice in the last couple of weeks we have heard, be holy for I am holy. And the way I've been presenting it is God is saying he's standing over here, and there's an invitation to come over here and stand with him. It is come be holy with me. It is not you go be holy. It's inclusive, not exclusive. And so in this case, I have underlined all of them. What does the abstain mean? We have to read a little further. Say to them, if any one of all your offspring throughout your generations approaches the holy things that the people of Israel dedicate to Yehovah, while he has an uncleanness, that person shall be cut off from my presence. Approaches, abstain. This word abstain is not a very good word in English. It actually means to separate from. And the best way to understand this, I think, last night we passed a loaf of challah bread around the table. Does it make perfect sense to everyone in the room? If you have a cold and a runny nose, you shouldn't be the one passing the bread. Does everyone make sense to everybody? Yeah, that's all it's saying. Recognize when you are unfit to pass other people's bread. So it says separate. Live your life so that you have a mechanism so that you come and say, I'm sick, I'm not going to touch the bread. While he has an uncleanness, I am Yehovah, because I am that way. Again, that's that inclusive language. He's not asking us to do things apart from him. He's asking us to do things to be included with him. None of the offspring of Aharon who has a leprous disease or any discharge may eat of the holy things until he is clean. Whoever touches anything that is unclean through contact with a dead man, or a man who has had an emission of semen, and whoever touches a swarming things by which he may be made unclean, or a person from whom he may take uncleanness, whatever his uncleanness may be, the person who touches such a thing shall be unclean until evening, and shall not eat of the holy things unless he is bathed in water. I like this, from whom he may take uncleanness. Last week we talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan and the people with religious jobs going to the other side of the road. I am sure, it might not be Torah, but I'm sure the teaching of the day was you could get uncleanness from that beaten, bloody guy on the side of the road. So they had to make a choice. Now it's debatable whether they made the right choice. If you're on your way to work, should you stop and help him? We need to weigh that. So unclean until evening, basically you have to take a bath. When the sun goes down, he shall be clean, and after that he may eat of the holy things, because they are his food. He shall not eat of what dies of itself or is torn by beasts, so make himself unclean by it. Why? Because that's part of God's nature. Come stand over here with me. I am Yehovah. They shall therefore keep my charge, lest they bear sin for it and die thereby when they profane it. I am Yehovah, who sanctifies them. Sanctifies them. Cross over the boundary and be holy with me. Step into my circle. A layperson shall not eat of the holy thing. No foreign guest of the priest or hired worker shall eat of the holy thing. This layperson is the word stranger that we had before, which means he doesn't belong. This word for foreign guest is the word stranger, which means sojourner. So the layperson is someone from Israel who doesn't have that job, which means they're not certified in that instance. And this is a sojourner. But if a priest buys a slave with his property for money, the slave may eat of it, and anyone born in his house may eat of his food. If a priest's daughter marries a layman, if a priest's daughter marries someone who's not a priest, what is her last name? It used to be Levi, and her last name now is Judah, for instance. Where should she be eating? With Judah. She shall not eat of the contribution of the holy things. But if a priest's daughter is widowed, which means Judah is no longer available for her, or divorced, either of these situations, I can imagine a rare situation where Judah would love their daughter-in-law so much that they would keep her even after their son was gone. That might be rare. And has no child and returns to her father's house as in her youth, she may eat of her father's food. Has no child, which means, what's the child's last name? Judah. So if she has a child, the tribe of Judah is going to be taking care of her and her child. So it makes perfect sense. She may eat of her father's food, yet no lay person shall eat of it. If anyone eats of the holy things unintentionally, he shall add a fifth of its value and give the holy thing to the priests. And I am emphasizing this is, in Scripture, it really does say he doesn't know about it. It does really say it was kind of like an accident. But I keep emphasizing unintentional is contrasted with those who do it with a high hand. Unintentional is kind of a mistake. High hand is, hey, look what I'm doing. Come do this with me. You're actually advertising your discretion, your indiscretion. You're advertising your sin. And this is interesting because this is exactly what David does with his men. They shall not profane the holy things of the people of Israel, which they contribute to Jehovah, and so cause them to bear iniquity and guilt by eating the most holy things. Why? Because I am Jehovah, and I sanctify them. And Jehovah spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons and all the people of Israel, and say to them, When any one of the house of Israel or of the sojourners in Israel presents a burnt offering as his offering, for any of their vows or freewill offerings that they offer to Jehovah, if it is to be accepted for you, it shall be a male without blemish of the bulls or the sheep or of the goats, and you shall not offer anything that has a blemish, for it will not be acceptable for you. And when anyone offers a sacrifice of peace offerings to Jehovah to fulfill a vow or as a freewill offering from the herd or from the flock, to be accepted, it must be perfect. There shall be no blemish in it. So we have a contrast between blemish and perfect. This blemish, again, it's not something that person did. It's usually something that person's born with. Or maybe a disease that they got that is not their fault. Again, people can argue, that's not fair. Animals blind or disabled or mutilated or having a discharge or an itch or scabs you shall not offer to Jehovah or give them to Jehovah as a food offering on the altar. Some of these we wouldn't even eat. Can you imagine something that you wouldn't put in your mouth and yet you offered it as an offering to God? You may present a bull or a lamb that has a part too long or too short for a freewill offering, but for a vow offering it cannot be accepted. Any animal that has its testicles bruised or crushed or torn or cut, you shall not offer to Jehovah. You shall not do it within your land. There is a debate on this one, whether that means no animals can be castrated or what. Neither shall you offer as the bread of your God any such animals gotten from a foreigner, since there's a blemish in them because of their mutilation. It will not be accepted for you. And Jehovah spoke to Moshe, saying, When an ox or a sheep or a goat is born, it shall remain 7 days with its mother, and from the 8th day on it shall be acceptable as a food offering to Jehovah. Why? So saying you can't eat an animal during that amount of time, and God doesn't want to eat an animal during those first 7 days. Why? But you shall not kill an ox or a sheep and her young on 1 day. So that would be taking the life of the baby and the mother at the same time. And when you sacrifice a sacrifice of thanksgiving to Jehovah, you shall sacrifice it so that it may be accepted. It shall be eaten on the same day. You shall leave none of it to morning. I am Jehovah, which means this is how I do it. This is how I think, and I want you to come stand over here with me. You shall keep my commandments and do them. I am Jehovah. And you shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified among the people of Israel. I am Jehovah who sanctifies you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Jehovah. We're back at the beginning. There's a microphone over here. Questions, comments? Give me a chance to catch my breath. All right. Is there? Yeah. Gita, is that? Good morning.
Good morning. I was looking at your questions, and I think you asked one about what was the first Moedim that we kept. Well, so I learned to keep Sabbath when I was very young, but not the other festivals. Of course, Sabbath is the first one in Leviticus 23. But the first of these other festivals was a Passover, and we were very new, but I loved how much it was all about Yeshua. And so you mentioned how people think when you're going back to the Moedim, then you're moving away from the right, which is Yeshua, but it is just seeing how much it's all about Yeshua, and then finding that in all the others was just the most amazing thing. And I think one of the thoughts was, wow, we just missed doing this all of this time, but thankful that now we can, and just have that new revelations each year as we celebrate it. And there is one other thing I wanted to mention as well, is you often ask us when we're reading these things to think about, who am I in this? And it made me think about 1 Peter chapter 2, that says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And again, it's that bringing that far right of, he's taken us from being in the world, but brought us into light, which brings us closer to him and to his holiness, and so much so that he calls us his priesthood. And he's calling us to be his priesthood. So I think keeping that in mind as I've been reading Leviticus has made it more meaningful to me, and something that I feel I can apply to me in these instructions that he's given.
Yeah, I like it. So that question, if Shabbat's important, what does that make Friday? Or Thursday, or Wednesday, the other days. In a marriage, we have different roles. You know, obviously I am the bigger half, and clearly she is the better half. We have different roles. My favorite thing was when my son got taller than me and it was no longer my job to screw in light bulbs. I loved passing that job on. But what does it mean that we do have different roles? We have different functions, but in a very real sense, not different values. Monday has a different function than Saturday, but we need Monday. And then the other one, the decentralized, the way I think of it is God is very centralized. He stands where he's going to stand, and yet his mighty right arm can reach anywhere. And what he does is he engages with us and brings us back to him. He sends his son out, no matter where you are. That verse, where can I go from his presence? I like to rewrite that, is where can I go from his son's presence? But then once you build a relationship with his son, what's the first thing his son tells you? I want to tell you about my dad. And his son brings us home. That's the paradox of balancing the centralized. God is centralized, and yet he reaches out into the darks and the depths and draws us back. Announcement time. We are videoed. We are on YouTube. During this time, the camera will show the crowd. If you don't want to be on YouTube, there are some pews at the back here or at the back there where you will be safe. I am doing another class. That shows up pretty well. I've done communication boundaries a couple of times. The most we had was probably 28 people, and the least we had was maybe a dozen. So that's how much the group had fluctuated. But a lot of people said they wanted more work on boundaries. What we're actually going to do is just read through the book and then discuss it. We won't read it in person, but we'll discuss it in person. Kind of like a line by line, what did this mean to you? It'll be on Tuesday nights, not this Tuesday, starting the next Tuesday. Who is this for? If you really like the Boundaries book, and you've read it, or if you are interested in the concept and you're like, hey, it makes perfect sense, you don't need any help. How many of us can have a full refrigerator and diet and exercise all by ourselves with no support? If you're that way, you're stronger than the most of us. If Boundaries makes perfect sense to you, you probably don't need it. This is for is people who don't like this book. They don't understand this book. They react to this book. That means we need a group of people to help each other walk through it and say, what is it about me that says I shouldn't say no? So there's a sign-up sheet. It will be blue. It will be out on the board, and we'll start in 2 weeks. I'll announce it again next week. Word study. I want to talk about Peter. We're in Matthew 26. Who wrote Matthew? It wasn't Peter. The last question about Peter's denial. It said at the end that he swore and cursed. How did Matthew know what Peter did? Contrast Judas and Peter. One of them went and hung himself, and the other one went and confessed to his brothers what he had done. Peter's denial is in all 4 of the Gospels. How does Peter feel about that? Now, most of us think that Mark was written by Mark, but mostly it's the first-hand eyewitness accounts of Peter, so it's kind of like Mark ghost wrote, well, the opposite of ghost writing, I guess. He authored the Gospel of Mark, but the fact that his denial is in everyone's Gospel means he told them. Imagine that conversation. If you do not want to repeat a behavior, go tell your brothers. Confession is how we break the cycle. If he would have hidden what he had done, guaranteed he'll do it again. That's just the way we work. Comments? All right. Blemish, talked about that. Appointed times. I like this. This is in the King James. Moedim is plural. Moed would be singular. It is not, I talked about chronos and kairos before. Moedim is not accurately translated into the Greek. Most of the time it's just feast or Shabbat. But those are like the proper nouns. Those are proper nouns versus the larger concept of God has put a mark in time and space for us to meet with him. Moedim in King James, most often the time, is translated as congregation. And why it's in King James that way is because it's the tent of congregation. In most of our versions, it says tent of meeting. We use the word congregation for what's going on here, which begs an interesting question. We wouldn't be here if there wasn't an appointed time. You don't go to a meeting when there's no meeting, right? For 2 men to walk together, they have to meet at the same time at the same place. And so this congregation, it's an interesting thought. We wouldn't have congregated had there not been a reason to congregate. The Moedim are the reasons to gather. First time we see Moedim, where do we think that one is? Let there be lights in the expanse of heaven to separate day from the night, and let there be signs for seasons and for days and for years. It is those markers in the sky that let us know if we are close or far, from an appointed time. That is chronos. There is a keeping track. Genesis 17:21, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year, at this appointed time next year. Is there an appointed time to be born? Yeah, and we all get uncomfortable if you're too far either way of that appointed time. Too early, that's a problem. Too late, also a problem. And then Exodus 29, then you shall bring Aaron and his sons to the doorway of the tent of meeting and wash their hands. And that's where Moedim is connected with the place of meeting. And here, so I have blaspheme in the Hebrew and blaspheme in the Greek. In the Greek, it's 3 words, a bunch of them. What exactly, so this is question number, and by the way, I email out the worksheet. If you'd like to be on that list, give me your email. What exactly happened with this blaspheme at the end of the Torah portion? What exactly did he do? Because before this portion, we've heard in the 10 words not to take his name in vain. He didn't take his name in vain because they would have known what to do about that. They already had a law about that. So he did something different and disturbing. So blaspheme in the Hebrew is, in English, I think this is King James again, there's 25 times. It's 6 times curse, expressed, blaspheme, bore, name, pierce. And I do not know Hebrew. I simply know how to use the computer and do a word search. It has to do with naming and designating. It's about being very specific, and the specificity has to do with God's name. So whatever this kid did, we don't know how old he is. The fact that it mentions his parents is important. But he did something with God's name that was so disturbing to the community that they didn't know what to do. They basically put him in jail and then waited to hear what God had to say. We might get some clarification in the Greek. So I like this one, false testimony, which is connected. And it's pseudo-martyr, basically. Martyr means witness. The word witness in Greek is martyr. And that basically means you hold on to your testimony even until death. That's the definition of a good witness. And false witness, this verse, classic. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. This is a weird 2 verses. I like this false witness, particularly in Mark. Mark 10:19. You know the commandments. You do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother. Mark 14, 4 chapters later. Some stood up and began to give false witness against him, saying. Mark 10 says, don't give false witness. Mark 14 says, they gave false witness. It clarifies what they did here, clarifies what Torah meant. It is standing up in a court of law or before a tribunal or something and slandering or lying to get someone in trouble. Some of these false witnesses, so the connection between false witness and blasphemy is you're slandering. I take it kind of to mean God has said he stands in this circle, that he is holy. It's slander to say, no, he's not. He's not in that circle. He's over there. It's redefining his name, redefining his character. And then blasphemy in the Greek, 28 times it's speaking against God's character and God's name. 26 times it's speaking against a man and his name. Once it's speaking against the goddess, Diana, I believe. So we don't use blasphemy this way. If someone denigrates your character, we probably wouldn't call that blasphemy. And yet in the Greek, it's the same word. So it depends who you're slandering. And I like this one a lot because Paul, what does Paul say? So Matthew 27, this is one of the blaspheme words. And those passing by were hurling abuses at him and wagging their heads. The making fun of Messiah on the cross is called blasphemy because they were insulting him. Acts 13, when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and began contradicting the things spoken by Paul. They were blaspheming. So in that case, the people in the crowd were speaking against the teaching of Paul, and Acts records that as blasphemy. This is Paul firsthand. And I punished them in all the synagogues. I tried to force them to blaspheme. Paul says what he was doing by persecuting the church was trying to get them to blaspheme, which means they were saying, Yeshua is right here standing in the circle with God. That's what they were saying. And he was trying to force them to separate the two and say, Paul wanted them to say Jesus is not over there. And then he recognized he was trying to force them to blaspheme. And then Titus 1:13, even though I was formerly a blasphemer. So Paul makes an I statement and said, I was separating the Father from the Son. That's blasphemy. Romans 2:24, for the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. That's an interesting thought. Our behavior discredits God's name. Romans 3:8, and why not say, as we are slanderously reported, as some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may come. So this is a rhetorical argument in Romans chapter 3. He says, why not say, as slanderously reported, as blasphemed, which means people have this report about me and my teaching that I tell people it's good to sin because then God pours out grace. That was a misinterpretation. Romans 14:6, therefore do not let what is a good thing be spoken of as evil. Do not let a good thing be blasphemed is what that verse says. And then finally, Romans 13, and the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore, and then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names. Some versions say there were the many heads, and they were speaking blasphemy. I like the blasphemous names. What would a blasphemous name be? Like we have all of those characters in Hebrew especially, and their name ends with Yah, or begins with Yah. God's name is incorporated into their name. Let's just say these are blasphemous names. I don't need us to say it, but what would these names be? They're going to be a name that includes God's name and twists it. And there's got 10 heads. Yeah. Over here, Gita. Yeah, raise your hand high for the guy at the back. Trying to get him to learn everybody's name.
Before we finish, I wanted to point out something that stood out to me in Ezekiel 44.
Excellent.
And I actually have written down in my scripture, after circling these 2 verses, that this is, to me, the core of Leviticus. In Ezekiel 44, verses 23 and 24. And they shall teach my people the difference between the holy and the profane, and cause them to discern between the unclean and the clean. And in controversy they shall stand in judgment, and they shall judge it according to my judgments. And they shall keep my laws and my statutes in all my assemblies, and they shall hallow my Shabbat. So I think that that's a really important function of this whole book of Leviticus, to understand what is clean, what is unclean, what is right and not right, and discern the difference between those things and keep them as our measure of judgment, of how we should interact with our surroundings and with others.
Yeah, and back to the carrying the bread when you have the flu, probably shouldn't. If someone tells you, hey, don't carry that bread, you're dirty, is that an identity statement? Do you take that as condemnation? Or do we say, yeah, in this phase of life, I shouldn't carry the bread, but I'm still loved, I'm still valuable. If we can't separate behavior and identity, we struggle with the book of Leviticus, yeah. Yeah, very good. Appreciate your time. We're out of time. Let's close this in prayer. Father, I thank you for this group. I thank you that you draw us near. And there's nothing between us and you when we are repentant. There's nothing between us, ever. We thank you that as we go throughout this week, we would bring some of this joy and confidence to the people we encounter, that we would have divine appointments. We might not know about them, but you do. That we would encounter someone at the grocery store or on the street, and they would ask us that very important question, what must I do to be saved? And we get to say, let me tell you about my God. We ask this with absolute confidence in your Son, what he's done for us. Amen. We'll see you back here in about 15 minutes.